June 21, 1941. Dawn rises over Warsaw. The streets are quiet, but a strange tension hangs in the air. Tanks rumble in the distance, and the smell of diesel and wet earth mixes with gun oil. Soldiers polish their boots, believing nothing can stop them, while their commanders whisper of world domination. And yet the very power they hold, the victories they celebrate, is already sowing the seeds of their downfall. From the deserts of North Africa to the islands of the Pacific, the Axis seemed unstoppable, but hidden dangers lurked everywhere. Have you ever wondered when the Axis powers were truly at their peak, and how they went from unstoppable to collapsing in just months? Today, we're diving deep into that story, uncovering shocking victories, massive expansions, and the surprising turning points that changed the course of World War II forever. Before we start, make sure to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss stories like this. Like the video if you enjoy epic history stories, and stay with us until the end. The full story will completely change how you see World War II. The air over Europe was thick with anticipation and fear. In Berlin, banners fluttered over the streets, their swastikas catching the last rays of the summer sun, while in Tokyo, the distant clatter of shipyards echoed across the harbour, mingling with the smell of salted sea air and freshly forged steel. It was a world on the brink, and yet for the Axis powers, it was a world of possibility, a stage on which Germany, Italy, and Japan could perform their grand designs of conquest. Germany's lightning campaign against Poland had stunned the continent, a display of mechanized warfare that combined speed, precision, and brutal efficiency. It was as if the ground itself had been torn from beneath our feet, wrote a Polish civilian trapped in Warsaw. By the end of 1939, the Reich had absorbed Poland into its orbit, and the Wehrmacht's confidence surged. In France, the Low Countries, and Norway, German troops advanced with near impunity, supported by air power that filled the skies with the roar of Messerschmitt engines and the acrid smell of aviation fuel. The occupation brought not only territory but resources. Industrial plants, labor, and raw materials flowed back to Germany, fueling the war machine. Factories churned out tanks, planes, and artillery at rates that stunned the Allies. By mid-1941, Germany was producing over 7,000 aircraft and 20,000 artillery pieces annually, a staggering output that underscored its industrial dominance. Italy, meanwhile, pursued ambitions in the Mediterranean and North Africa. Mussolini's troops had secured Libya, and campaigns in Albania and Greece gave the fascist state a foothold in the Balkans. Yet for all its ambition, Italy was dependent on Germany's military genius and industrial backbone. Italian soldiers marched under the blazing sun of the Sahara, boots sinking into sand, rifles rattling with every step, as Rommel's Afrika Korps advanced methodically westward. Supply lines creaked under the weight of tanks and trucks, the diesel and dust forming a haze that hung over the desert like a tangible spectre of both opportunity and overreach. Despite their veneer of power, Italy's victories were uneven, hinting at the fragility hidden beneath their imperial aspirations. Half a world away, Japan moved with astonishing speed across Asia and the Pacific. The conquest of Manchuria had been a decade in the making, but by 1941, Japan had expanded into China's eastern provinces, and its navy and air force were poised for operations across the Southeast Asian archipelago. Singapore, Malaya, the Philippines, Borneo, Sumatra, each territory fell in rapid succession, captured by amphibious assaults that combined the thunder of naval guns with the staccato bursts of machine guns. The scent of salt water, gunpowder, and tropical vegetation filled the air as Japanese forces advanced, often meeting resistance but rarely failing to impose order. These early victories showcased Japan's military acumen and underscored the speed at which it could project power, creating an empire that stretched from the Korean peninsula to the doorstep of Australia. By June 21, 1941, the Axis powers were poised at a zenith rarely matched in history. Germany's armies massed along the eastern border ready to strike at the Soviet Union, their tanks glinting in the early morning light, engines throbbing with lethal intent. Italy's forces, though uneven, held the Mediterranean and North Africa, projecting influence across a region vital to global trade. Japan, emboldened by rapid conquests, prepared for further expansion into Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. Across continents, millions of soldiers, sailors, and airmen waited on the cusp of campaigns that promised to redraw the map of the world. Yet the paradox was already present. For all their territorial control and military might, the Axis were overextended. Supply lines stretched thousands of miles, vulnerable to disruption. Attrition had begun quietly, unnoticed amid the fanfare of victory. Factories worked at maximum capacity, yet even Germany could not infinitely replace the trained soldiers and experienced pilots lost in skirmishes. Japan, for all its rapid conquest, faced logistical nightmares in feeding and arming its far-flung forces. Italy's ambitions strained its limited resources and exposed its dependence on Berlin. The apex of power, it seemed, contained the seeds of vulnerability, a subtle foreshadowing of the reversals to come. As the sun climbed over Europe, soldiers prepared to cross borders, ships sailed into distant waters, and commanders plotted campaigns that would shape the fates of millions. The Axis powers had reached their summit of apparent invincibility, yet the very decisions that promised glory would trigger a chain reaction that no map, no plan, and no confidence could contain. This wasn't propaganda, it was reality, poised at the moment when ambition, power, and human error intersected, setting the stage for both triumph and inevitable decline. The stage was set, the players ready, and the world itself seemed to hold its breath. But what they saw next, a series of audacious invasions, naval battles, and turning points, would shatter the certainty of conquest and redefine the trajectory of the war. From Europe to North Africa, from the deserts to the Pacific Islands, the first glimmers of the Axis decline were already taking shape, hidden in plain sight behind victories that seemed absolute. By the autumn of 1940, Europe had become a continent under the shadow of the swastika. Paris, once vibrant with cafes and street musicians, now echoed with the metallic clatter of German boots and the rumble of mechanized convoys. The Low Countries and Norway had fallen swiftly, their capitals subdued within weeks. For the Axis, victory seemed inevitable, the march of conquest a symphony of precision and terror. The paradox was unmistakable. Men who had dreamed of empire now moved through cities that smelled of soot and fear, yet the machinery of war was admired even by its victims. As one Belgian factory worker later wrote in a diary, the Germans came with iron but also with efficiency. The air smelled of smoke and ambition. Germany's occupation strategy combined terror with calculation. Factories were seized, retooled, and pressed into service for the Wehrmacht. Coal from the Ruhr, steel from the Rhineland, and agricultural output from occupied Poland flowed seamlessly into the German war economy. By 1941, Germany was producing more than 2,000 tanks, 20,000 artillery pieces, and 7,000 aircraft annually, numbers that dwarfed the combined output of many neighboring nations. At the same time, millions of forced laborers were conscripted from occupied territories, their hands cold, fingers blistered, working under watchful guards. One memoir recounts a Polish laborer in a factory outside Krakow. "We fed the machines fed the army, yet we starved quietly in the corners." The contrast was stark, abundance and scarcity, power and oppression existing side by side. The Balkans too reflected the Axis ambition and its paradoxes. Germany had invaded Yugoslavia and Greece in rapid succession, aided by Italian forces whose coordination was often cumbersome. The conquest secured strategic ports and airfields while providing access to crucial raw materials. Yet the human cost was enormous. Civilians fled across mountains, cities were shelled, and guerrilla resistance began to simmer in the hills. Mussolini's soldiers, marching through dust and sweat, were often left trailing German units that moved faster, cleaner, and with ruthless precision. Italy's ambitions, though grand on paper, exposed the limits of its military and foreshadowed its dependence on German engineering and strategy. The Mediterranean theatre highlighted the global stakes of Axis power. Italy's navy, though formidable in size, was constrained by fuel shortages and strategic miscalculations. Rommel's Afrika Korps in North Africa pushed relentlessly toward Egypt, engines whining, dust filling the air, the desert sun scorching steel and flesh alike. Supply convoys creaked along the Mediterranean, loaded with tanks, guns and ammunition, yet they were vulnerable to British submarines and air attacks. One soldier recalled the strange scent of diesel and sand, as if the desert itself had been weaponized against us. The campaign demonstrated the fine line between territorial control and overextension. The Axis could conquer vast areas, but sustaining them was a different war entirely. The occupied territories were not passive prizes. Resistance movements in France, the Low Countries and the Balkans began to form, often small, often underarmed, but resolute. Their sabotage, derailing trains, ambushing patrols, whispering intelligence to the Allies, was a reminder that Axis power, no matter how absolute it seemed on paper, was never unchallenged. The paradox was ever present. The more territory Germany controlled, the more fragile its grip became. Every factory producing tanks was also a factory producing resentment. Every city under occupation hid sparks of defiance beneath the surface calm. Despite these tensions, by mid-1941, the Third Reich had reached an apex of European control. Germany's borders stretched from the English Channel to the outskirts of Moscow, a continental giant fueled by industrial might, coerced labor, and the ruthless efficiency of its military. Soldiers marched with polished boots, rifles gleaming, engines humming, a display of raw power, discipline, and organization. Yet beneath the roar of victory lay the whispers of attrition, the first frost-bitten deaths on the Eastern Front, the weariness of supply lines stretched across thousands of miles, and the ever-present specter of partisan attacks. The paradox remained. Dominance and vulnerability coexisted in every conquered city, every desert campaign, every factory. The Axis had created an empire of impressive reach, yet the very breadth of its conquests planted the seeds of its undoing. The machinery of war, which seemed invincible, would soon encounter challenges that no map, no calculation, and no confidence could overcome. But for now, Europe lay largely subdued, its resources harnessed, its cities subdued, and its people watched over by armies that moved with terrifying efficiency. The stage was set for the next act, a grand offensive that would push the Reich even deeper into the east, setting into motion the chain of events that would eventually unravel its seeming invincibility. While Germany's war machine thundered across Europe, Italy pursued its own ambitions in the Mediterranean and North Africa, often straddling the line between audacity and overreach. Mussolini, dreaming of a revived Roman Empire, dispatched his troops into Libya, Ethiopia, Albania, and the Balkans. The sun-baked deserts of North Africa were alive with the metallic screech of wheels on sand and the acrid tang of diesel fuel, as Italian tanks clattered behind German advisors, attempting to assert dominance over vast, empty expanses. We marched under the sun, engines roaring, yet always trailing shadows we could not see, recalled an Italian private stationed near Tobruk. The vastness of the theatre itself became a test of endurance, as supply lines stretched hundreds of miles across shifting dunes, vulnerable to air raids and naval interdiction. Italy's naval aspirations were equally ambitious but fraught with difficulty. The Regia Marina, though substantial on paper, struggled to contest British dominance in the Mediterranean. Convoys moving men and material from Italy to Libya often faced Royal Navy attacks, submarines lurking beneath waves like invisible predators, and sudden storms that turned loaded decks into treacherous, slick plains of steel. The smell of salt and oil combined with the stench of burned diesel on deck, a constant reminder that ambition could not alone guarantee success. Italian forces at times relied heavily on German support, illustrating the paradox of power. The facade of autonomy existed, but true military efficiency depended on Berlin's expertise and resources. In the Balkans, Italy's campaigns were similarly double-edged. While the conquest of Albania and parts of Greece expanded the Axis footprint, it revealed critical weaknesses. Logistics were strained, morale fluctuated, and partisan activity simmered in the hills, harassing supply lines and communications. Civilians witnessed a parade of foreign soldiers, each representing the conflicting ambitions of Axis leaders. One Albanian farmer later noted, "We were occupied by the Italians first, then the Germans, The ground beneath our feet changed rulers like the wind changes direction. Even as Italy seemed to extend its influence, the reality on the ground was precarious, a stark reminder that holding territory demanded more than victory on paper. Rommel's Afrika Korps, although commanded by a German general, relied heavily on Italian infrastructure and cooperation. The desert campaigns became legendary, sand blurring the horizon, engines whirring, rifles cracking in the distance. Tanks maneuvered with precision, yet the supply network groaned under the weight of hundreds of vehicles, artillery pieces, and thousands of soldiers. The Axis forces in North Africa had reached their zenith by mid-1942, threatening Egypt and the Suez Canal. Yet every kilometre gained demanded resources, planning, and coordination that stretched Italian and German capacities to their limits. The desert, beautiful and merciless, became a crucible testing the very viability of the Axis dream. The paradox of Italy's power lay in appearances versus reality. On paper, Mussolini's empire extended from the Mediterranean to North Africa, brimming with strategic ports and colonies. In practice, the army faced shortages of fuel, unreliable equipment, and coordination problems that undercut its effectiveness. Italian victories were often overshadowed by German intervention, a silent acknowledgement that independence was more illusion than reality. Civilians and soldiers alike felt the tension, the smell of roasted rations over campfires, the constant rumble of engines, the feel of sand and dust in every crevice, all underscored the challenge of sustaining a sprawling, ambitious war effort. Yet, despite these underlying weaknesses, Italy's territorial ambitions contributed to the Axis perception of invincibility. The Mediterranean and North African theatres symbolized strategic potential connecting Europe with the Middle East and Asia. Ports, airfields, and road networks allowed the Axis to project power across continents, creating an illusion of seamless dominance. Mussolini's forces, though flawed in execution, represented a crucial component of Axis overreach, a partner whose successes and failures would intertwine with Germany's and ultimately influence the broader trajectory of the war. By mid-1942, Italy's Mediterranean campaigns had reached their maximum operational reach, mirroring the continental dominance of Germany and the far-flung Pacific expansion of Japan. The Axis, in theory, spanned the globe from North Africa's deserts to the Pacific's tropical islands, from conquered European capitals to occupied Asian cities. Yet each victory, each mile gained, carried the weight of fragility. The paradox was clear. Italy's achievements enhanced Axis prestige, but also revealed the limits of coordination, resources, and sustainable power. Their campaigns, magnificent on paper, hinted at the vulnerabilities that would soon become unavoidable. The stage was now set for the Axis powers to reach what many consider their apex of global influence, yet the seeds of their undoing were already sown in the deserts of North Africa and the coastal cities of the Mediterranean. Every port, every convoy, every tank reflected both the promise and the peril of expansion, a story that would soon intersect with Germany's eastern ambitions and Japan's Pacific blitz. What they saw next, as the world held its breath, would test the limits of empire, endurance, and the human cost of overreach. Across the vast expanse of the Pacific and East Asia, Japan's military juggernaut moved with breathtaking speed. By early 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army had carved an empire spanning thousands of miles, from the coastlines of China to the islands of the Pacific. The scent of salt water mingled with gunpowder and the tropical heat as Japanese forces stormed beaches, captured ports, and occupied cities with astonishing efficiency. Soldiers moved in synchronized formations, their uniforms pressed, rifles glinting in the sun, while warships patrolled strategic choke points, the hum of engines punctuated by distant gunfire. The contrast was stark. In one moment, they celebrated triumph. In the next, civilians fled in terror, smoke rising from bombed towns. The conquest of the Philippines in early 1942 was a demonstration of Japan's strategic precision. Forces landed on Luzon and Mindanao, encircling American and Filipino troops in a campaign that combined aerial bombardment, artillery, and swift amphibious operations. Manila, once a bustling colonial capital, became a city of fire and shadow, its streets choked with smoke and the cries of the wounded. General Douglas MacArthur's forces were forced into retreat, the smell of gunpowder lingering over jungle trails as soldiers evacuated under relentless pressure. The Philippines fell within weeks, showcasing the terrifying efficiency of Japan's military machinery. Meanwhile, in Malaya and Singapore, Japanese troops advanced down the Malay Peninsula with a speed that stunned both British defenders and local civilians. Tanks churned through dense jungle paths, artillery cracked in the early morning mist, and the air was heavy with the combined sense of damp earth, rotting vegetation, and burning villages. By February 1942, Singapore, considered the Gibraltar of the East, surrendered, marking one of the most humiliating defeats for the British Empire. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival later described the city's fall as a mixture of disbelief, exhaustion, and resignation, capturing the psychological blow dealt by Japan's unstoppable advance. In Borneo, Sumatra, and parts of New Guinea, Japanese forces extended their reach with remarkable coordination, often landing simultaneously across multiple points, overwhelming defenders before they could regroup. Amphibious landings were accompanied by the roar of naval guns and the clatter of landing craft on coral reefs. The smell of salt and smoke hung over the beaches as soldiers scrambled to secure airfields and ports critical for future operations. Japan's expansion into these territories not only brought resources such as oil, rubber, and tin under their control, but also demonstrated the strategic vision that had propelled them across Asia with almost mechanical precision. Yet, even as Japan seemed unstoppable, the paradox of overextension began to appear. Each occupied island, each captured territory, demanded garrisons, supply lines, and administrative oversight. Tropical diseases, logistical bottlenecks, and the challenge of coordinating forces over thousands of miles of ocean added strain to their seemingly limitless power. Rear Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself noted in a wartime diary, "Our victories are swift, but the shadow of distance and supply follows every triumph." The very success that had built the empire also sowed the seeds of vulnerability, an unseen counterweight to the dazzling advances. The smell of diesel on Guam, the crackle of gunfire in Malaya, and the heat of the jungles were all sensory markers of a force at its zenith. Japan's military machine projected strength and fear simultaneously, yet each victory created a broader front to defend. The paradox of empire became increasingly clear. The larger the territorial gains, the thinner the line between control and collapse. While the Axis in Europe was poised against the Soviet Union, and Italy's ambitions stretched across North Africa and the Mediterranean, Japan's reach into the Pacific mirrored the overextension that would soon challenge all three powers. By June 1942, Japan had reached the peak of its operational expansion. Their empire stretched from the Philippines to Burma, from Borneo to the Solomon Islands, securing resources critical for sustaining their war effort. At this moment, the Axis as a whole, Germany dominating Europe, Italy in the Mediterranean, and Japan across the Pacific, appeared unstoppable. Yet beneath the surface of victory, logistical strain, attrition, and the first hints of Allied countermeasures quietly gathered momentum. Soldiers, sailors, and civilians alike felt the paradox of triumph and vulnerability. The empire was vast, impressive, and terrifying, yet every mile conquered created a new frontier to defend, a new challenge to meet, and a hidden crack in the seemingly invincible armor. This was the moment when Axis power, at least in terms of territorial reach and operational success, stood at its zenith. The apex before attrition, strategic miscalculations, and Allied resolve would begin to shift the balance irreversibly. From the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of Southeast Asia, the stage was set for the dramatic reversals that would follow, as the tide of war slowly, inexorably began to turn. By June 1942, the Axis powers stood at a summit of unprecedented reach and apparent invincibility. Germany's armies had advanced nearly 1,000 miles into the Soviet Union, capturing vast swathes of land, seizing factories, railways, and farmland, while the Wehrmacht's mechanized columns moved with terrifying efficiency through the mud and snow of the Eastern Front. Soldiers' boots sank into thawing soil, the smell of diesel and machine oil, mingling with the scent of gunpowder and the distant smoke of burning villages. Every mile forward felt like another step into eternity. a German lieutenant wrote, and yet the horizon never seemed closer. Factories in occupied Europe churned out over 20,000 artillery pieces and 7,000 aircraft annually, a staggering production that fed the war machine and emboldened its leaders to believe victory was inevitable. Meanwhile, Italy's influence in North Africa and the Mediterranean had reached its practical limit. Rommel's Afrika Korps threatened Cairo and the Suez Canal, while Italian forces secured ports, supply lines and strategic choke points along the coast. The desert sun scorched the steel of tanks, the sand clinging to every uniform, every boot, every wheel. Convoys creaked under the weight of fuel, ammunition and men stretching thousands of miles across dunes and valleys. Yet paradoxically, the more territory Italy controlled, the more fragile its grip became. Every mile gained in the Sahara was a mile of vulnerability added to the Axis equation. Across the Pacific, Japan had captured the Philippines, Singapore, Malaya, Borneo, Sumatra, parts of New Guinea and Guam, extending its reach from China to the Solomon Islands. Naval fleets moved with precision through salt-scented waters, while soldiers slogged through dense jungles where tropical heat, mud and disease challenged even the most disciplined units. Japanese forces had achieved rapid conquest unmatched in modern military history, yet the very success that showcased their skill also exposed overextension. Rear Admiral Yamamoto noted the logistical nightmare: victory stretches our reach, but stretches it thin. The paradox was evident. The empire was at its zenith, yet already fragile. June 1942, then, represents what many historians consider the true apex of Axis power. Across continents, millions of soldiers stood ready, tanks gleamed in the sun, and warplanes roared across the skies. From the deserts of North Africa to the frozen plains of Russia, from the tropical jungles of Southeast Asia to the islands of the Pacific, the Axis controlled more territory, manpower, and resources than at any other point in history. They had momentum, opportunity, and confidence. And yet, hidden in that momentum were the seeds of decline: overextended supply lines, attrition, untested garrisons, and the looming industrial might of the Allies. The paradox of mid-1942 was striking. Men who had marched to victory across Europe and Asia were poised at the very height of power, yet the decisions they made now, launching campaigns into the Soviet Union, holding thousands of miles of territory in Africa, and spreading forces across the Pacific, would soon unravel their dominance. Every tank lost in Russia, every convoy sunk in the Mediterranean, every island garrison strained in the Pacific was a silent herald of the reversals to come. It was as if the very breadth of their victories contained the blueprint for their eventual undoing. This apex also carried human dimensions. Civilians in occupied territories were conscripted, displaced, or coerced, while soldiers on all fronts faced the strain of endless marches, blistered hands, and the constant roar of artillery and engines. Diaries and memoirs from the time describe both awe and terror. Admiration for military precision mingled with the visceral reality of death, hunger, and exhaustion. One German soldier on the Eastern Front wrote, "We were at the height of triumph, yet I could feel the weight of every man lost, every mile overextended." The Axis had reached a summit, but it was a summit built on fragile foundations. By the summer of 1942, the world's perception of Axis invincibility was near total. Reports from Berlin, Rome, and Tokyo painted a picture of unstoppable advance. Maps were drawn with bold strokes, showing territories under Axis control stretching across continents. Yet in reality, cracks were forming. Fatigue in troops, stretched supply lines, overstretched command structures, and the first glimmers of effective Allied resistance. The stage was set for dramatic reversals, from Stalingrad to Midway, from El Alamein to Guadalcanal, that would test the limits of conquest and shatter the illusion of unassailable power. The paradox could not have been clearer. They had reached the pinnacle of might, yet the seeds of decline were already sown. Every triumph contained the potential for disaster. Every victory extended the frontiers of vulnerability. And as the war would soon demonstrate, the Axis would learn that absolute conquest in theory was far different from sustainable dominance in reality. The tide of war began to shift in late 1942, when the very ambitions that had propelled Germany to its zenith became the instruments of its vulnerability. On the Eastern Front, Operation Barbarossa had stretched the Wehrmacht across 1,000 miles of Russian plains, with tanks, trucks and infantry pushing relentlessly toward Moscow and the oil-rich Caucasus. The winter, however, revealed the paradox of German invincibility. Soldiers froze in inadequate uniforms, engines seized in the icy mud, and supply lines groaned under the weight of mechanized units and artillery. The air was sharp with frost, and the acrid smoke of fires set to keep men alive, a scent that mingled with the heavy stench of death in newly conquered villages. The Soviets, long thought incapable of meaningful resistance, executed Operation Uranus in November 1942, a meticulously planned counteroffensive that encircled the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad. Witness accounts from both sides describe a surreal scene: the whistle of artillery shells, the thud of bombs, and the anguished cries of men trapped in a cauldron of fire and mud. One German officer wrote, "We were masters of Europe, yet here we were, trapped by our own overreach and the tenacity of an enemy we had underestimated." By February 1943, the Sixth Army surrendered, marking not only a catastrophic military defeat, but a psychological turning point for Germany. The aura of invincibility had shattered, replaced by the creeping realization that resources, manpower, and strategic initiative were finite. Meanwhile, in North Africa, Rommel's Desert Campaign had reached its own crisis. At El Alamein, British forces, led by Montgomery, used logistics, superior artillery, and tactical ingenuity to halt the Afrika Korps. Sand swirled around tanks and trucks, filling eyes and mouths, mingling with the metallic tang of spent shells. One soldier recalled the constant rattle of guns over the dunes. The desert was alive with the roar of engines, yet every echo was a reminder that we were not as untouchable as we believed. By November 1942, the Axis position began to collapse under the weight of attrition and coordinated Allied offensives, culminating in the Operation Torch landings in Morocco and Algeria that opened a new front. Suddenly, the seemingly unstoppable Axis advance was forced into retreat, signaling the beginning of a protracted decline. Germany's industrial and human resources, once thought sufficient to maintain global dominance, were being stretched to their breaking point. Factories operated at full capacity, producing thousands of tanks, aircraft, and artillery pieces. Yet the losses on the Eastern Front, combined with Allied bombing campaigns targeting key industrial centers, gradually eroded the Wehrmacht's effectiveness. Civilians in Berlin and Hamburg described the constant drone of aircraft engines and the acrid smell of smoke as incendiary bombs lit the night sky. The contrast between the early triumphs and these mounting pressures underscored the fragile foundation of Axis power. Italy's contribution to the Axis decline became increasingly evident. Overextended in North Africa, its troops often required German reinforcements to stabilize fronts. Supply shortages, tactical errors, and poor morale plagued Italian units, revealing a stark contrast between the ambition of Mussolini's rhetoric and the realities of execution. Italian officers described the desert as a beautiful graveyard, the sun scorching steel and men alike, reminding them that territorial reach alone could not guarantee sustained power. The paradox of Axis supremacy was most starkly evident in their overextension. Germany's Eastern Front bled men and material. North Africa became a logistical nightmare. Japan's Pacific Empire, though vast, strained supply chains and garrisons across thousands of islands. Every gain created new vulnerabilities. Soldiers on all fronts, whether freezing in Russia, choking on desert dust, or slogging through tropical jungles, were confronting the unseen consequences of ambition. Victory had brought territory, but with it came fragility, attrition, and the inevitability of counterattack. By the end of 1942, the war had irrevocably shifted. Stalingrad's encirclement, El Alameин's defensive triumph, and the opening of new Allied fronts signaled the start of a domino effect that would unravel Axis momentum. The very campaigns that had marked the high point of power now highlighted its limits. Paradoxically, the more the Axis had conquered, the more exposed it became. The world had observed the peak of empire, and now it would witness the slow, inexorable turning of the tide. While Europe and North Africa wrestled with the limits of Axis expansion, the Pacific became the stage for Japan's first real reversal. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had seemed invincible, met its match in the waters near Midway Island in June 1942. For months, Japan had advanced with breathtaking speed, capturing the Philippines, Malaya, and Singapore. Sailors smelled salt and oil, and the horizon seemed infinite as fleets moved with precision. Yet at Midway, that momentum collided with American planning and intelligence. U.S. forces, having broken Japanese codes, waited in ambush. The clash of carriers unleashed a deafening roar of engines, anti-aircraft fire, and exploding ordnance, turning the blue Pacific into a chaotic tableau of smoke, fire, and sinking ships. The loss of 4 Japanese carriers and dozens of experienced pilots at Midway was catastrophic. Admirals had counted on initiative and surprise, but reality shattered assumptions. Japanese officers wrote in diaries of the disorientation. We had planned for triumph, yet the sea itself seemed to betray us. Midway marked the end of unchecked expansion, the first serious blow to Japanese naval power, and the beginning of a defensive posture that would define the rest of the war. The Pacific, once a map of Japanese dominion, now became a theatre where every advance would be contested, every island hard-won. Soon after, the grueling campaign on Guadalcanal further exposed Japan's vulnerabilities. U.S. Marines and Japanese forces clashed in dense jungle, under tropical rains that turned trails into mud and skies into oppressive humidity. Gunfire cracked, shells whined, and the smell of gunpowder mixed with rot and vegetation. Soldiers fought in near-constant exhaustion, every footstep a struggle through mud, blood, and tangled roots. The Japanese defenders, though disciplined, faced the harsh reality that speed and surprise were no longer sufficient. Allied counter-offensives had caught up with the Empire, turning victories into costly stalemates. The paradox of Japanese supremacy mirrored that of Germany and Italy. Rapid conquest created strategic depth, but also logistical fragility. Islands thousands of miles apart had to be garrisoned, supplied, and defended, straining manpower and resources. Tropical diseases claimed lives alongside bullets, and tropical storms wrecked supply lines. Rear Admiral Yamamoto's warnings about the overextension of Japanese forces had proven prescient. The same speed and audacity that had brought triumph were now the chains that slowed further expansion. By the end of 1942, the momentum of the Axis powers, whether in Europe, Africa, or the Pacific, had been decisively checked. Germany's eastern ambitions faltered at Stalingrad. North Africa began to slip from Axis control after El Alamein and Torch, and Japan's advance in the Pacific was stalled at Midway and Guadalcanal. The illusion of invincibility had been shattered, replaced by the grinding reality of attrition, logistical strain, and determined resistance. Soldiers, civilians, and commanders alike began to understand that the apex of conquest had passed, and the war would demand a different kind of endurance. The sensory reality underscored the strategic shift: the smell of burning ships, the taste of dust-choked air, the feel of mud-clogged boots, the unrelenting roar of artillery, all became markers of a world in which Axis power was no longer unchallenged. The global reach that had seemed an emblem of unstoppable strength was now a liability, exposing every vulnerability to counterattack. The Pacific reversal was both literal and symbolic. It represented the point at which Japanese momentum ended and Allied initiative began. What had seemed a moment of absolute supremacy, a zenith of coordinated power across continents, now revealed the paradox of empire: the higher you climb, the farther you can fall. Midway and Guadalcanal were not isolated events. They were the opening chords of a long symphony of Allied counteroffensives that would echo across Europe, Africa, and Asia. Victory had expanded the Axis footprint, but it had also set the stage for strategic collapse. And as the war unfolded, every mile conquered, every island seized, every city occupied, would remind them that supremacy on paper could not endure against the weight of geography, logistics, and the determined resilience of the Allies. By 1943, the cracks in the Axis edifice had widened into chasms. Stalingrad lay behind Germany as both a grave and a warning. The Sixth Army's destruction became a symbol of hubris and miscalculation. Soldiers trudged through the rubble and snow, faces frostbitten, breath mingling with smoke from makeshift fires, every step a reminder that dominance was fragile. "We thought ourselves unstoppable," wrote one German lieutenant, "yet the cold and the enemy taught us otherwise." North Africa had been reclaimed by the Allies, Rommel forced into retreat across dunes once thought impregnable. The Mediterranean, once a theatre of potential, now teemed with Allied convoys, mines and patrols, straining Italian and German forces alike. In the Pacific, Japan's empire, once stretched like a magnificent web across thousands of islands, faced relentless Allied pressure. Guadalcanal remained a battlefield of mud, blood and rain. Midway had claimed the carriers that had once embodied Japanese naval supremacy. The smell of salt, smoke, and rotting vegetation was ever present, mixing with the cries of exhausted soldiers and the relentless drone of aircraft engines. Supply lines stretched thin, disease claimed more lives than bullets, and every island garrison required reinforcements that Japan could scarcely provide. The paradox was clear: expansion had created vulnerability. The very territories that symbolized triumph now dictated strategic caution. Italy's ambitions had similarly waned. The Sahara sun no longer dazzled but burned, supply convoys groaned, and morale faltered under the weight of repeated setbacks. Soldiers marched with the dust of defeat clinging to boots and uniforms, realizing that Mussolini's grand designs had overextended their capacity. Germany's reliance on Italian troops revealed the brittle interdependence of Axis partners, a partnership whose initial victories now seemed fragile under the pressure of global conflict. By mid-1943, the momentum of the Axis powers had decisively shifted. Germany was forced into a defensive posture on the Eastern Front, attempting to hold territories it could no longer support sustainably. Japan's Pacific Empire became a patchwork of isolated outposts, each under constant threat. Italy's Mediterranean operations faltered, revealing systemic weaknesses in planning and logistics. Across continents, the initial aura of invincibility had given way to exhaustion, attrition, and mounting Allied pressure. The paradox of empire: the larger the conquest, the greater the vulnerability, had become undeniable. Yet the story of the Axis peak and decline also carried a human dimension. Civilians in occupied territories witnessed the collapse of authority, soldiers confronted the physical and psychological toll of attrition, and commanders struggled to reconcile ambition with reality. Diaries, letters, and memoirs of the era convey the paradox of perceived power versus lived vulnerability. One Japanese soldier reflected on the fall of Guadalcanal: "We had thought the world would bend before our might, but each island demanded a life we could no longer spare." Similarly, German soldiers at Stalingrad recorded the bitter taste of hubris, frost, and gunpowder, the smells and sensations marking the line between triumph and catastrophe. The lessons of the Axis zenith resonate far beyond military campaigns. Across Europe, Africa, and Asia, the interplay between ambition, overreach, and resistance illustrates the fragile architecture of dominance. The paradox of apparent power juxtaposed against underlying vulnerability defines the rise and fall of Germany, Italy, and Japan. They had reached heights unmatched in history, yet every achievement contained the seeds of its own undoing. Soldiers, civilians, and nations experienced firsthand the tension between conquest and sustainability, momentum and attrition, perception and reality. In the final reckoning, the Axis powers had come as conquerors, spreading across continents with speed and seeming invincibility. Yet by 1943, they were forced into a defensive posture, grappling with the limits of logistics, manpower, and strategy. Their peak was brief, brilliant, and ultimately a prelude to decline. They had reshaped the world, yet the very territories that demonstrated their power also demanded sacrifices they could no longer meet. They had come as conquerors, they left as students. And as history would teach, in the end, dominance built on fear, ambition, and overreach could not withstand the combined pressure of strategy, resilience, and human endurance. In the end, America's greatest weapon was not its bombs, but its abundance, an inexhaustible resource against which hubris could not prevail.